Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wookieecast. Today we're here with Steven Melching. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. He has written for several Star Wars TV shows with Lucasfilm Animation, and some other projects, probably. So, um, I'd love if you could get into a little bit of how you first started writing for Lucasfilm Animation.
Oh, sure. Well, I had started writing for animation in 1993 on the X-Men animated series for Fox Kids, and I had been working pretty regularly writing for different shows in animation until 2005 when I was invited to meet with Catherine Winder, who was interviewing people to be the head writer on a new Star Wars animated show, The Clone Wars. And I met with Catherine and had a great meeting with her, but did not get the job, but made a good enough impression that she remembered me, and uh, she and Henry Gilroy hired me to write as a freelancer for the Clone Wars, the first few seasons. And as a lifelong Star Wars fan, I saw the first movie in theaters when I was 9 years old. It was literally a dream come true to have the opportunity to work on Star Wars animated series.
That's really interesting. So you were involved from starting from the first season, roughly, you think? Was it the first
Yeah,
season?
yeah. I want to say I was in maybe the second freelance writer they hired on the show when they got started in the very first season, and I wrote, oh, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 episodes in season one, and that was a very um, tumultuous time at Lucasfilm Animation in that they were literally building the studio from the ground up. It was George
Mm.
Lucas, Dave Filoni, and Henry Gilroy doing the initial creative development on the series. Primarily Dave and Henry. George wasn't super involved at that time, but they were also building the infrastructure for the entire studio from scratch. So they were hiring artists and tech people, and fortunately, that's something Lucasfilm has always done really well, is building companies that can make technology to do what they want to do. So there was a long, this was my meeting with Catherine was in 2005 before Revenge of the Sith was released. In fact, Henry Gilroy and Dave Filoni got a private screening of Revenge of the Sith up at Skywalker Ranch before it came out, so they knew what they were in for writing the series. So that was 2005. So it was a full 3 years before the movie and the series debuted. So there was a very long development period of writing and art uh, development and creating the technology and the animation studio and everything. And at one point during that process, you know, the creative direction of the show changed a couple of times during that period, and they started to get behind schedule. And Catherine hired me to come up to Skywalker Ranch and help Henry Gilroy rewrite the first 10 or 12 scripts so that they were more in keeping with the creative direction at that time. So I got to spend a couple weeks up at the ranch working on the show intensely every day, which was a lot of fun.
That's really interesting. So I didn't realize it was in development that far back, but that
Yeah.
does sort of make sense. Um, with some of the creative direction, would you, were there any aspects of it that you wish maybe had stayed in that didn't quite make it?
No, I mean it's interesting. The show that Dave and Henry created for George was very much like how the show ended up by season 4 or 5. It was very serious. It was very in the tone, was very much in keeping with the movies. And I think I wasn't present for these conversations, but this is what I was told when George watched the first couple of animatics, which is a rough version of the animation of the episode. He thought the show was too intense and too dark, and he thought it should be lighter. So we went back in and tried to lighten the tone of those early episodes, which is why that first season had a lot more sort of humor in it, battle droid humor, and lighter toned episodes. Um, but over time, like a lot of shows, it just got more serious as the stakes got higher within the universe of the show as the war progressed, and as the studio realized the kinds of things they could do with that animation, the scale of the stuff they could do as they built out more and more assets. When a computer animated show starts off, you have to build everything you see on the screen individually, and it's very expensive. So when we were writing those early episodes, we only had a handful of characters to work with. Writing these episodes, and fortunately the show had a lot to do with clones and battle droids, which are easily, replicated. You don't have to
Right.
build a bespoke individual, you know, fully rigged face for, 30 different characters. They could just retexture the clones with different tattoos and hairstyles and stuff like that to individualize them. So we had a kind of a limited palette to work with in those first couple of seasons. And they kept scaling back what we could, the number of sets we could have, the number of vehicles, things like that. But as the show developed, it got to a point where they had this vast library of CG assets to draw from, so they could do these huge, epic battles and whatnot, which is
By
really
season
exciting.
7, it was like they were doing all sorts of stuff
Oh
by
yeah, it
then.
was
So,
crazy. It was like a movie every week.
I did actually have one question for you in particular about some of the things. I did see in there was an episode about Jar Jar that you wrote. I'm not sure it was like Jar Jar the Jedi, Bombad Jedi.
Oh
I'm not
yeah.
sure if you would remember because it was so long ago, but one of the trivia guides says that originally some other character was supposed to be there, and that was scaled back because of asset reasons. I was curious if you might remember anything about that. It was
Uh,
Quinlan Voss, perhaps?
oh yes, that's right. Yeah, that was a script that I ended up doing some rewriting on. I believe the original writer of that script was Kevin Rubio, who did the short film Troops, the internet short film Troops, which was a Star Wars cops parody that I also worked on. And Kevin wrote that episode, and then he had gone on to other things, and I was brought in to rewrite that episode among others. And yeah, that episode was just too big. I think it was just there was just too much happening in it. And adding the Quinlan character would require an expensive build for a character that probably wouldn't have much to do in the series moving forward. So it was kind of a cost benefit analysis. Like, I don't think we really want to spend the resources to build this character and put him into an episode that was already pretty jam packed.
Hmm.
So he was removed. I want to say by the second draft, maybe of the script. He wasn't in it that long, but ultimately they did bring him back because he's a cool character.
Yeah, for, it's really interesting to see characters that kind of originate in print media appearing in other forms of media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I would love to talk more about the Clone Wars, but I did promise a friend that we would ask a lot about Star Wars Resistance and get back to some of the other stuff later.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
so Star Wars Resistance, it was coming out around this time of the sequel trilogy. I was curious if you could talk about getting involved with that, and had you seen the sequels before getting involved with that, or was it like coming out around the same time?
Yeah, that was an interesting period at Lucasfilm. I had just finished working on Star Wars Rebels that maybe we can talk about another time. And there was an episode in that show with Saw Gerrera, and Rogue One was in development at that time. So we went into the studio. Ended up going into the Lucasfilm Animation offices in Burbank and reading a couple early drafts of the screenplay to Rogue One just to know what the story was and what the Saw Gerrera character was like by that point uh, in the continuity. And we developed the show based on that. So it was a kind of a similar situation in Resistance, where The Force Awakens had come out, and I had seen Force Awakens several times by that point. Um, and but by as we were working on season 2 of Resistance, the timeline of the TV series was going to start to overlap with the timeline of the movies, and it was challenging because everything was so compartmentalized at Lucasfilm, and they, you know, obviously they were very concerned about leaks, and there's a voracious appetite for any information about upcoming projects. So they were very secretive, and it was very difficult to get information about what was going to happen in episode 8, The Last Jedi, because our show was going to, we had characters crossing over. We had Poe Dameron and BB-8 and General Leia and all these other characters that were no doubt going to be part of the movies, but we didn't know what we could do with them. We didn't even know when The Last Jedi was going to take place in the continuity. Was it 2 years after Force Awakens? And of course, it ended up being almost immediately after the end of. So we didn't have a lot to work with there. Unlike, between Star Wars and Empire, I think there's like a 3 year gap that you could do stories in. And this one, it's like it's right on the tail. So we really needed to know what was going to happen in episode 8 so that we could tell our stories. So again, they brought us in to the offices to read the script for episode 8, and the script that I was given was heavily redacted. So there was, there would be scenes and then there would be just blank pages. And then suddenly characters would be somewhere else. And, like, how, what's Luke doing there? Like there's all this, this stuff that they decided wasn't important for us to know. So they just lifted those scenes out of the script. So we just had a basic idea of what the overall story was and when it took place in relation to Force Awakens and how long a period of time that story took place during. So, in season 2 of Resistance, we caught up to the movies and then went past and shot right past them. But we didn't even know, like, are any of these characters going to die in this movie? Are we allowed to use them? Is somebody going to get captured or disappeared or frozen in carbonite? Like, we don't even know. So it was challenging, and we did have people in the room like Pablo Hidalgo who could steer us, who knew everything and could steer us around some of the stuff that we just couldn't be privy to in its entirety.
Like, you can't use that character. They're dead by now.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of important information. Like, oh no, you wanted to put Poe in there? I'm sorry, he gets killed in episode 8. No. But yeah, no. So yeah, they did provide us with the information that we needed to stay within the continuity that because the movies and that are always at the top of the pyramid. It was the most important continuity that we had to respect in all these shows.
It's really interesting. Did a lot of the writers migrate from show to show, kind of, from Clone Wars, Rebels to Resistance?
Yeah, I think I might be the only writer that went on to Resistance from the previous shows. I was on Clone Wars off and on for the first 4 seasons, and then went on to other things, and then I was brought into Rebels in season 2 and worked pretty much full time as a freelancer in season 2, and then as a writer and story editor on seasons 3 and 4. And then that show wrapped, and I went on to something else briefly, and then they brought me into Resistance as a writer and a story consultant for season 2, to help, the showrunner Brandon Auman and Justin Ridge, can sort of take some of the pressure off them when it comes to. We would do these internal meetings with the producers and the staff, right? The head writer Brandon in that case, and me, story consultant, where we would figure out what the stories were going to be for the season, or at least for the next, a broad outline for the season, and then what the next 6 or 7 stories were going to be, and then we would flesh them out internally into these maybe 2 page documents that have kind of the broad strokes of what's going to happen in the episodes, and we would get feedback from the producers and Dave Filoni, and then we would convene up in San Francisco. At that time for Resistance, we would meet at the Presidio at the Lucasfilm offices there in downtown San Francisco, and we would meet over a period of usually 3 days, and they would fly in the writers for those 6 episodes, and we would just break them down scene by scene in more detail, as a group. and then we would all go back to wherever we're from and work individually on our outlines and scripts. And then we would repeat the process every time there were more episodes to do. That was the same process we did on Rebels, and similar to what they ended up doing on Clone Wars. Clone Wars was purely freelance writing for the first couple of seasons, and then towards the end, they adopted a more traditional writer's room, not quite writer's room, but they would do these story conferences where they would bring all the writers for the entire season up for like 2 weeks, and they would just do an intense story seminar for the entire season with all of the writers and Dave Filoni and George Lucas. Um, so yeah, that was a process that worked well because then you can see how the whole story is going to lay out, and everyone that's involved knows what all the other storylines are, so you know where your story sits in relation to the other ones for continuity's
It
sake.
wouldn't do to have this really happy character right after their parent died or something, right?
Yeah,
I feel
exactly.
like out of place. Since you've worked extensively in animation, what would you say is a general time frame, just for people who are curious, from script to when it's finally out on the screen? Because I'm sure that's got to be a lot of lead time.
Yeah, it kind of depends. It's usually about a year, give or take, from the beginning of the writing process to the finished episode airing. That can change. It's usually not much shorter than that because it just takes time to produce the animation. Um, in the case of Clone Wars, we started the writing on Clone Wars in the summer of 2005, and I think the movie came out in when did it come out in
2008, it was somewhere in
August
there.
August of 2008, and then the series started in October. Although the movie was made up of episodes of the series that were edited together into a movie. Um, so that was like a 3-year time period, and by that point, you know, I think they were well into producing the second season or even beyond. The episodes kind of slipped around a little bit in Clone Wars, but that was a special case because they were building the studio
Right.
from the ground up. But when I worked on a CG show like Transformers Prime, it was about a year, maybe a little over a year for the first season, but maybe a year for subsequent seasons between writing and generally the writing process would take about 8 weeks, give or take, from initial idea to record draft script. And then the scripts would go into recording. They record all the voice actors, and then all that material would go to the episodic director and the storyboard artists, and they would create the storyboards and or the animatic, depending what techniques they're using, and then it would go into animation and then finally post-production sound and music and all that good stuff.
It's really interesting because a lot of people don't know a lot about the process. They see the finished, and sometimes there's trivia about, oh, this got cut or this, but the writing process is itself very interesting. So, thank you.
Yeah, generally speaking, in an animated series, you'd start with a premise. Sometimes the premise is generated internally, as was the case in all the Star Wars shows I worked on. Other times, this isn't as common now as it was when I started in animation, where writers in, would be invited to pitch ideas to a show, and you would just come up with 4 to 6, you know, 2 paragraph ideas and pitch them to the producers, and they would pick the ones that they liked. Um, and then you would go off, and so it was kind of your show from your story from the beginning. It originated with you as the writer, or sometimes they would give you an idea and have you flesh it out, and you'd usually take a couple weeks to write an outline and get feedback, and then a couple weeks to write the first draft script, and then you get feedback, and then another week to write another draft, and then maybe another few days or a week to write a third draft, and then the script would become the sort of the responsibility of the head writer or the staff writers to take at the remaining drafts until you get your record draft.
I guess that's something interesting about Resistance compared to something like the Clone Wars, where instead of a lot of single standalone stories, it was very much a lot of the later episodes you worked on season two, they all kind of tie into each other. like back to back. So I was curious if you could talk about some of the episodes that you wrote. You wrote the some of the introduction episodes to season two. They're running from the First Order. So it's kind of introducing the audience to characters that they haven't seen in a while. What's your process for that?
Um, some of that depends on who your audience is and how much sort of hand-holding you want to do with your audience. If Resistance was aimed at a slightly younger audience than Clone Wars and Rebels, that was sort of baked in to the premise. I remember Dave Filoni talking about Resistance while we were working on Rebels, and he wanted to do a show that had kind of a lighter tone, that was a more a fun adventure show for a younger audience, and he was inspired a lot, I recall, by believe it or not, sitcoms, like workplace sitcoms. Like he mentioned Cheers a lot, or Frasier, or The Golden Girls. You know, the idea where you have this group of characters that are kind of bound together by a location. You know, with Cheers, everyone's at the bar, or whatever. And these people are all friends or colleagues, and they have all their um, sort of sitcom relationships, people that like each other, don't like each other, or whatnot. And he combined that with there was a show on in the 70s called Baba Black Sheep that was about a World War II fighter squadron in the Pacific. So it was about, a group of fighter pilots on a remote Pacific island with their squadron of planes that would go out on missions fighting in World War II. So that was something of an inspiration as well for Resistance. So we kind of mashed all those ideas together with the sequel era and the politics and the state of the galaxy in the sequel era, and kind of making it its own thing. And we did stuff like I think my first episode, The Disappeared in season one, was about an authoritarian government or entity coming into a place and making the people that oppose them disappear, which unfortunately is a little too timely right now. But uh, we uh, we also look at history and current events sometimes to inform the kind of stories we're doing. It's kind of unavoidable, I think with any creative writing, it's a product of its time and what's the zeitgeist, what are people thinking about and talking about in society, and becomes important to your storytelling.
And if it's a recurring theme, then it's a recurring theme. It's real.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. So anyway, I guess to answer your question, in season two, when we're kind of hitting the ground running, and we don't want to, it is for a younger audience, so sometimes you try to remind people who the characters are and what their relationships are, but you try to do that in a way that's not too obvious. Try to pick up the story in progress, and let people play catch up a little bit. I think that's always a fun way to keep an audience engaged in what's happening. So it's not just a purely passive experience. You're trying to figure out, oh, what's going on? How much time has passed?
that's for true, true. And for Resistance, you also did more story consulting work as compared to in the past shows, you maybe were only freelancing or only writing, or, well, that was your main role. So what's the difference between writing and necessarily story consulting?
Well, yeah, as a freelance writer, you're just you know, you call it, you're an independent contractor. So you're not on staff, you're not a regular employee, you don't have a weekly salary or anything like that. You're just hired to write one script, or it's usually one at a time, and if you do a good job, maybe they'll hire you to do another script. um, and so that's your sole responsibility, is that one script. And so in the case of Lucasfilm, for Rebels and Resistance, they would, as a freelancer, fly you up to wherever the story conference is going to be. With Rebels, it was usually at Skywalker Ranch or Big Rock Ranch. With Resistance, it was at the Presidio, Lucasfilm. And you'd sit in a conference room with all the other freelance writers, and then the producers and executives from Lucasfilm, and we'd have a big For Rebels, we had a big dry erase whiteboard, and somebody would get up there with different color markers, and you'd number the scenes and write out the scenes, and you usually didn't know which episode was going to be yours to write during this process. And I think you do that deliberately to make sure all the other writers are paying attention to everything that's happening because this episode might be yours. So you better be pay attention. With Resistance, we used a lot of 3x5 cards tacked to a bulletin board. And it was usually my job because I had pretty good printing. So I would usually be the one writing out the 3x5 cards and tacking them up on the board while Brandon Auman would sort of lead the discussion as the head writer and producer. And that's a great process because everyone's contributing to every script.
It's not like
And
one writer made the entire story of their script. It might have had bits and pieces from
oh,
other writers.
absolutely. Yeah, it's usually you usually start with a couple pages that was generated by Lucas, the people on the show, the full-time writers. So you'd have that to start from, but they didn't always work when the rubber meets the road. So there's always things that are going to change as you're developing an episode, and that might be because something changed in episode three. And so now suddenly something down the line, episode five, doesn't track with what happened in episode three. So we have to pull out those ideas or adjust them so that it works in the serialized continuity of the show. And as this process goes, you the writers generally tend to gravitate towards one or two of the stories that they really like. And so when the meeting ends on day three, we figure out, okay, who's going to write what? Like, does anyone have a strong attraction to one of these stories? And that's when we sort of debate over who's going to, who gets what episode. And at that point, you take ownership of your episode, and then it's your responsibility to write the outline and then the script drafts, and then you're done. And you hope that maybe you'll get called to write another one, and then you just repeat the process.
It's really interesting. And it kind of leads into my next question. I have no idea if you'll remember this because it was a very long time ago. And I did leave a note about it in the question list, but we have been trying to hunt down information on two episodes that got cut from Resistance Season 2. They're about
Yes.
Maz Kanata and Mika Gray. If you remember anything about them, we'd love to hear about it.
Well, I wrote one of those episodes.
Oh,
I don't know how much I can talk about it because, we were all bound by non-disclosure agreements, and I
Brandon
don't
did
want to.
give us the plot, if that helps. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's out there. It's out there already.
Okay.
We just didn't know who wrote it, so we can credit you
Yeah.
now.
So as I looked at my notes before this interview, and it was according to my notes, it was episode 19, 219, episode 19 of season two, and that was a heartbreaker because I believe, if I recall correctly, Disney Plus decided to cut the order of Resistance season two. Originally, I think it was going to be maybe 24 episodes or 22 episodes, and they cut two episodes out of the order very late in the process. And poor Brandon and the other producers had to look at all, I think I had written two drafts of that script by that point. So it was practically done, I think, or very close to finished. So poor Brandon had to look at all the episodes and figure out which ones can we pull out of the Jenga tower of of season two without collapsing it. And then with those pieces missing, he probably had to go back in and tweak the other episodes to make sure the continuity still worked between them. So yeah, so 219, the working title was The Lost Book, and it was a story where Maz Kanata and Mika Gray, we learned that they were former partners in the pirate game, and they were after sort of a treasure, a Jedi holocron that was taken from the ruins of the Jedi Temple, and there were several parties that wanted to get their hands on that book. And I think the idea was Maz Kanata wanted the book so that she could pass it along to Rey as part of her Jedi training. So that and the book was in a vault inside a ship that was marooned inside a nebula that was slowly getting consumed by a young star. So the gravity was sort of slurping up everything, and they had to get into this nebula, find the ship, and they were in a race against time against another group of pirates that wanted, that were also on the trail of this book. So it was a cool episode. And I was very excited to get to write an episode that had, Maz Kanata, who's a movie character. It's always fun to write an episode where,
Yeah.
an important character like that appears. It's a great responsibility, but it's also a lot of fun. And so writing, and she was just a fun character to write for. Unfortunately, she never really got to do a whole lot in the movies. Um,
Right. And she's been in all these books and everything since, but it's
yeah.
not quite the same. So,
Yeah, and so like this is our opportunity, like, oh, we can give her some room to breathe, and we can see more of her personality, and we can learn more about her backstory and her relationships with different characters. And that kind of happened in uh uh what was oh God, was the first episode of season two, with um I'm blanking on the title, but
Into the Unknown, I think.
Into the Unknown. Yeah, or maybe it was Mission Breakout. Maybe it was Mission
Breakout was
Breakout.
the one with Norath
Breakout.
Kev that you
Yeah,
also
okay.
wrote with.
So Breakout. Breakout originally had Poe Dameron was in Breakout.
Hmm.
He was with Kaz on the planet, and initially in our early conversations, that planet was going to be Batu, from uh, Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland. That land was in active development at that time, and we had several conversations about incorporating it into Resistance. But ultimately, I think the decision was to give Resistance more of its own personality. And I think there was a real fear that it would be perceived as blatant product placement for a theme park. And like, yeah, but it's a planet. It's cool. It adds some back, we get to learn about it. I didn't really see it that way, but that was a concern,
Yeah.
and probably a legitimate concern. So it was easy enough just to change it to and make it an original planet. Poe Dameron was in the story, and it was, the script I wrote initially had Poe in them, and it was cool once again to write a movie character in the show. But I think ultimately it was another case of the episode was just getting too crowded. There's too many characters, and I think it was also challenging to get Oscar Isaacs to do his voice performance because he's such a busy working actor, and I want to say he was making a movie in South America at the time, so it wasn't easy to book him into the studio. And unfortunately, the reality is, I mean, you can get away with doing temp voices for a time, but at a certain point you need the final
Right.
voice tracks for the lip sync and the sound mix and everything. So they just decided it just wasn't going to work with Isaac's schedule. So the two factors together said, well, I just cut him out of the episode.
Well, so was Poe with Kaz and Norath, or did he replace, like, was Norath replacing him in the
No,
script?
Norath was in there also, so they
Okay.
were they were all there, and it was, that's a big
Okay. So
group,
it was, yeah, that's a
but
lot.
ultimately I think it worked.
It did,
It probably
yeah.
worked better with just Kaz and Norath and BB-8, uh, and running around in that situation. You have to have another character as part of that group. It's another, it just starts to get crowded.
I think the episode before that also had another spy on the planet, according to
Mm,
the some of the cut content that StarWars.com released. So that would have been a lot. That would have been four
right.
resistance people. Like,
This
uh,
place is crawling with spies.
yeah, I totally get what you mean. The last question I had for here was, or for Star Wars Resistance specifically, was if you had any favorite part about writing Norath, because he's such a humorous character, and even though they're in a dire situation, he's just like very funny.
That's what I really enjoyed about working on Resistance, because Clone Wars was started out as being as serious, but then it got kind of funny, and but it was a serious show. Although it obviously had its digressions. It had some, like the droid quadrilogy where it's all the droids, Sunny Day in the Void and all that. So they could do episodes that were funny or funnier, but overall it was a very serious show. The tone was pretty serious, especially as it progressed towards season 6, 7. It got super serious. And Rebels started out as a lighter show in season 1, but gradually got dark and then went to some really dark, sort of operatic places. But there was still some humor in that show. Sometimes it was dark humor with Chopper and oh gosh, what's his name? My favorite glum droid that Steven Staunton did the voice for, AP AP5,
Mm,
right? Is that his name?
yeah.
Uh, who was named after Athena Portillo, who was 5 feet tall. So that's why he was named AP5. Uh, just like CB-23 in Resistance was named after Carrie Beck, CB Carrie Beck. We always like to slip in little things like that. But anyway, Resistance was fun because it was a show that was conceived to be more of a lighter character um, series. So it was just more fun. It was more slapsticky at times, and you could get character banter and stuff. And so Norath Kev was just a really fun character where he could have a fun banter with Kaz, and so it was just it's great to stretch to write that kind of stuff
Yeah,
when
sure.
when the rest of the time you're writing like really heavy people, getting killed and you know horrible things happening in the galaxy.
It's true. You mentioned that sometimes things get named after people. Was anything like that snuck into Resistance in a way?
In Resistance, I don't know. Aside from Carrie Beck, CB-23, I don't know what the 23 stands for. I don't know. Because my role in the show, or at least by the time I came on, a lot of the development was done. Sometimes as a writer, you need to name things. A planet needs a name, or a droid needs a number, or you need a number for something. And I've been known to slip my birthday into things like, you need a string of numbers. You just put in your birthday, or put in my mom's birthday, or take a friend's name and change the syllables around to kind of make a new name. I don't recall me personally doing that in Resistance because I don't think I really had much to sort of name and make up in that show. It was already established, but I definitely did that a lot in Rebels and Clone Wars.
Well, we'll have to talk to you soon about that.
Yeah.
To finish out, if people would like to keep up with what you're up to nowadays, where can they find you online?
Online, I have a Blue Sky account, Blueski. I think it's just Steven Melching. Um, I don't remember the naming conventions on Blue Sky. I was on Twitter or X for a long time, but I'm not really posting there anymore. But you can link. I'm at Steven Melching on X or Twitter, and my link to Blue Sky I think is in my Twitter bio, so you can find me on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram, but I haven't posted anything on Instagram, but I am on Instagram under my name. And then I'm part of a couple of podcasts of my own. If anyone is interested, I'm doing one long running podcast called The 4:30 Movie with several friends, where we curate a fantasy theme week of movies as if it was the after school movie. So we might do time travel week, and we'll discuss, what movie is going to be on Monday night, what movie is going to be Tuesday night, and talk about our favorite movies or movies we think are important, uh, given whatever the topic is. And then I'd also done another podcast called Cartoon Bar Room, with my friend Ashley Edward Miller, who's a screenwriter. And we interviewed a lot of people from different spheres in the animation world, from voice actors to writers to producers to um, editors, all kind. And we had a lot of great guests on that show. We're kind of on hiatus on that show, but I think we have 20 or 30 episodes that you can listen to. I know from the Star Wars world, we did a two-part deep dive with Sam Witwer.
Ooh.
Talked about a lot of Star Wars stuff. Vanessa Marshall was on from Rebels. I think we had Henry Gilroy, who was the head writer early on in the Clone Wars and Rebels. So there's definitely had several Star Wars related people on that show, and if we get around to cranking that podcast back up, I'm sure we'll have some more.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for your time today. Wookieepedia appreciates all that you do. We love
Abs-
documenting this stuff.
Well, and
So yeah,
I love using Wikipedia to do my research when I'm working on Star Wars things. I use it all the time.